Welcome, folks, to this afternoon's webinar with the Wisconsin Council of Churches and the Carter Center. And we are on part 2 of a 2-part webinar. Don't worry if you missed part 1, we will do our best to catch you up, and you will have access to the video of part 1. If you'd like to take a moment in the chat to introduce yourself and where you're from, we can start building a little bit of community. I'm Carrie Parker, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches, and we are here with Nathan Stock, an Associated Director of the United States Conflict Resolution Program at the Carter Center. We'll be starting our webinar in just a few minutes as we allow time for people to get logged in. So do make sure you mark your greeting in the chat window to everyone, not just hosts and panelists. Otherwise, it'll just be us who knows who you are and not everybody else in the webinar with you today. So we're really glad that you came to be with us for this important conversation. And we're really thrilled to have Nathan with us. Our first part of this chat was fascinating and important. And I know personally, my book list just got about 5 times longer. So it's really good to have you here with us, Nathan.
Happy to be here.
We met Nathan through the joy of networking. Our staff member, Brianna Elene, was able to make connections with you in the Carter Center. And Brianna is with us today as our technical guru. She is behind the Wisconsin Council of Churches logo on your screen, listening and also assisting with the chat. And we are always grateful to have her as part of the team as well. She is our content curator and ecumenical innovation coordinator. So let me tell you a little bit about who we have as part of this call today. Civil conversation, healthy public engagement, and faithful work in the public sphere have been elements of the Wisconsin Council of Churches work for a long time. Over the past few years, we've been thinking in more intense ways, of course, about faith and democracy. We're a network of 21 Christian traditions and faith-based organizations working together on issues that impact our communities and our houses of worship. We connect 2,000 congregations in the state, in addition to our other partners, and our efforts include ecumenical cooperation, community health, and advocacy for the common good. We aim to model the alternative to destructive voices around us, and we take as our guide values of courage and justice and holy imagination. Now, our partners at the Carter Center were founded by former US President Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind in 1982 to wage peace, fight disease, and build hope in communities worldwide. A not-for-profit, non-governmental organization, the center's worked in more than 80 countries to resolve conflicts, advance democracy, protect human rights, prevent disease, and improve mental health care. In the summer of 2020, the center launched a new stream of programming designed to resolve conflicts and strengthen democracy here in the United States. Which brings us to Nathan, our presenter today. Nathan Stock is the Associate Director with the Carter Center's Conflict Resolution Program. Since 2020, he's been leading this new project designed to mitigate political and identity-based violence here in the US. He's also a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute. He has 15 years of experience working to reduce violence and strengthen democracy abroad, including nearly a decade working on Middle East conflicts. He's lived and worked in Afghanistan, Gaza, and China. He holds an MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University and a BA in International Relations with Colgate University. Nathan, I am thrilled to have you and your expertise and your knowledge with us today. And I want to invite people that we don't just have to rely on your fixed presentation, but we also have time for Q&A at the end of your presentation. So hang on to your questions. type them into the chat. And if you are one of those bold people who likes to speak your questions out loud and you are not afraid to be on screen, we are willing to bring you on screen during the Q&A presentation at the very end of the talk. So if you think that's you, use the raise hand function in your toolbar here in Zoom, and we'll promote you. If that's not you and you're perfectly content, type your question in the chat, list it in the chat, and we will get to it when we get to the Q&A section. Is there anything else that I need to be saying, or should we just turn it over to you? Because I know you have a lot of good things to share with us.
Let's do it.
All yours.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Reverend Parker. Thanks, Reverend Helene and the Wisconsin Council of Churches for having me back, especially after last week's thoroughly depressing conversation. I appreciate all of you for turning in for part 2. I promise that today's discussion will be more uplifting. Indeed, as promised, we're going to talk about things that you can do to push back against these forces of polarization, which we talked about last week. In particular, we're going to consider what you can do at the individual level in your interpersonal relationships, at the community level, working in groups, and broadly for our country. So I want to start with the slide that I shared last week. This was the first slide we looked at last week. And you'll recall that I noted that this slide really illustrates the way in which we've polarized since the mid-1990s, with party affiliation now becoming much more predictive of the political and social views of many Americans, as opposed to race, religious tenets, etc. But I am starting with this slide this afternoon to make the point that it wasn't always like this. You'll recall last week we talked about the emerging research suggesting that in many ways our brains are wired for group thinking, for identification with groups, for a certain kind of tribalism. But of course, assuming that's true, and it appears to be, it's been true forever. It was true in 1994 when the survey was started, right? And yet you didn't see the kinds of polarization that you do now, which is a reminder to me that we can change this. This slide illustrates the ideological distance between the two dominant parties in both chambers of Congress since the Civil War, more or less. And what you see here is a period in the early 20th century of rapid depolarization. You'll recall last week, I listed a number of what I called structural drivers of polarization. These are things we've done in American society, technological changes, changes in the media landscape that have contributed to this moment of polarization. Well, this tells me that if we made these decisions, if we made these systems that have contributed to polarization, in turn, we can unmake them. That said, I do want to set expectations. This is a quote from a new book on this subject by Dr. Peter Coleman. He's an academic at Columbia and a conflict resolution expert. Like I outlined last week, he digs into the complex system, the forces pushing and pulling against one another that have created this moment of polarization that we're in. And as he notes, this is bigger and more powerful than any one of us. Now, why am I doubling down on this? Pardon me. Not to simply depress you, but rather I want to equip you today with a list of things that you can do to help address these profound challenges. And I don't want it to feel hopeless. I want to underscore that for all of us, this is going to be a long process. We're going to face setbacks, and we need to be prepared for that and frankly, not give up. So how do we get ourselves out of this mess? Well, first, I'm going to talk about what I see as 3 levels of intervention for addressing these challenges of polarization. I call them cousin, community, and country. Cousin is not limited to conversations with your cousins. It's just a stand-in for interpersonal relationships. These can be family members, including cousins, but this could also be difficult conversations with people you work with friends. The point here is I'm going to share a bunch of suggestions for successful interpersonal contact across lines of difference, especially where the goal is building trust and understanding. Then we'll talk about a series of what I call community level interventions, what you can do in groups and between groups to address some of these challenges of polarization, to build trust. And finally, we'll talk about national level interventions. We'll talk about this challenge of polarization as a national level problem and explore what we can do about it. One thing I want to note here is that in dividing these interventions between cousin, community, and country, this is a little bit artificial. I'm going to share lots of suggestions for at the cousin level, interpersonal things that you can do that will also be applicable to group level, to community work, and vice versa. This is just a way of simplifying the presentation and separating it out. Okay, so first thing to think about when considering how to talk to folks with whom you may have significant differences of politics or beliefs. It's a note of caution. This is from a Pew survey from 2018. As you have likely experienced, in this polarized moment we're in, talking to our fellow Americans about our differences can be rough. It can often go badly. So what I want to share here is really a set of suggestions to set yourself up for success, to ensure that when you undertake these difficult conversations with people you may disagree with, that you're more likely to have it be a positive experience for both sides. So suggestion number one is humanize, humanize, humanize. This is Rosie and Charlie, my 6-year-old and my 2-year-old. That's kind of how they are all the time. What's the point here? Well, the point is, don't start with the hard stuff. If you're a pet lover, share pictures of your dog, right? If you got grandkids, share pictures of the grandkids. Find ways to remind the person with whom you may disagree that you are more than your political disagreements, that you have these basic human connections and relationships in common that can smooth the subsequent parts of the conversation that may be challenging. That's suggestion number one. Second, I want to list a number of things that can help in terms of both listening and then communicating more constructively. I call these the 5 Ds of listening. The first is don't interrupt, don't name call, do practice active listening. Again, I think these, for many of you who may be yourselves clergy, I'm sure a lot of this is familiar to you. Nevertheless, it bears repeating. Active listening, as you probably know, is just the practice of reflecting back the key things you're hearing when someone's speaking to you. So I hear you saying that you're concerned about crime in our community, right? Just as a way of interjecting to show that you're really processing what the other person is saying. Crucially, listen to genuinely understand. When someone else is speaking to you and you're having this difficult conversation and you disagree on a lot of stuff, don't be thinking about your rejoinders. Don't be thinking about the things you're going to say. Instead, go into the conversation prepared for it to be a learning experience where part of your goal is simply to understand where the other person is coming from. And similarly, listen to what they're saying and reflect back the underlying moral values, right? So let's say you are a left-leaning person and you're listening to someone who's more conservative than you. That person's arguing that immigrants are dangerous and they commit crimes. Whether or not you agree with that, you can reflect back, hey, part of what I hear you saying is that that public safety is very important to you and you have some concerns there, right? This isn't necessarily agreeing with the other person, but it's getting at some of the underlying values that matter to them. And recall our discussion from last week about moral formation, the differing ways in which folks who lean more left or lean more right make decisions about right and wrong. This is a way to reflect that, hopefully also while building some foundation for understanding. So those are my 5 Ds. You can, of course, add to this list or subtract from it. But then let's assume you've listened constructively, you have a sense of moral values, you understand where the other person's coming from. Then what? How do you make your case constructively? First thing, I hear you as a pivot. Like, I got this. I've heard what you said. Then find ways in which you can reflect agreement. I used to do a lot of negotiation in the Gaza Strip with Hamas leaders of this Palestinian group. It's designated by our government as a terrorist organization. And some of those folks were very hardline ideologues with whom I really disagreed. But I could begin some of those sensitive conversations by saying, well, we can certainly agree that conditions in the Gaza Strip are very bad, that many people are suffering. Let's figure out together how to get out of it, right? So find ways, even if it's the lowest common denominator, to demonstrate that you do agree on some things as a starting point. Second, tell the story of how you came to your views. Make it personal, right? Maybe you're someone who leans more right and you support more policing, maybe harsher sentences in the criminal justice system. Talk about why that is. Have you been a victim yourself of violent crime? Are there people in your family that have been victimized in that way? Talk about that. It helps the other person understand where you're coming from. Also, when you're talking about an issue that's very sensitive to you, that's very emotive, that you get hot under the collar about, signal that in advance. Signal strong feelings. Hey, listen, this issue for me, questions around abortion, they're really personal to me. I feel really passionate about this. This is a way of helping the other person kind of manage your emotions, anticipate where you're coming from, and also sort of smooth bumps in the road. And last but not least, when you go into these challenging interpersonal interactions, again, set your expectations. Don't assume you're going to agree. Assume that you're doing this to better understand one another. This is a dialogue, not a debate. The goal is improved understanding. Okay, so those are some suggestions for effective listening, effective communicating. But another thing I want to leave you with is that it's worth committing for the long haul. If you think what I'm saying makes sense, then I would suggest you pick one or two relationships in your life for whom you want to engage in repeated interactions. Maybe it's, a cousin and a coworker who you disagree with. Accept that you're going to have multiple interactions, multiple hangouts or meetings or beers where you're going to talk about some of these things that are areas of disagreement. And focus, as you're doing that, on building underlying trust and understanding. If you commit to that longer term set of engagements, in my experience, you can certainly build trust and understanding, even if you don't necessarily agree on the issues. So that's a bunch of suggestions for how to make some of these challenging interpersonal interactions more successful. But I also want to talk about group level engagements and group dynamics. And my first suggestion here, and this also applies on the interpersonal individual level, is find ways to emphasize shared identities. So you may recognize this, right? The graphic here is a take on the Pittsburgh Steelers logo. The normal Steelers logo, of course, has a yellowish or beige diamond on the top there. This is a meme that was created in Pittsburgh after the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue shooting, in which 11 people were murdered. And in the aftermath of that hate crime, this hashtag went around. So what's this communicating here? This is was a way at the time for people in Pittsburgh to say, we're going to rise above this, for one thing, and that whatever else our differences may be, there are some things we agree on, right? We agree that was a horrific act of violence and mass shooting, but also we have these other things that bring us together. We're all Steelers fans in a town like Pittsburgh. Be intentional about finding things that bring you together and that don't emphasize the things you disagree on. Maybe you and the person you're talking to, or in the groups you're talking to, you're all Star Trek fans. Talk about that. You guys, most of you are in Wisconsin. Maybe you're Packers fans. Talk about that. Lead with that as a common source of shared identity. Don't use language, that emphasizes the ways in which you're different. I recommend against saying things like red and blue. Don't say that your fellow American is a red or blue. That kind of language reminds me of the Russian Civil War, the reds and the whites, right? We don't want to emphasize the differences that we're trying to bridge. Similarly, when thinking about group dynamics and how to structure engagements between different groups for success, there's been a whole body of research on something called contact theory. This work was started by an academic named Henri Tajfel. I think he wrote a paper on this back in 1970. And the original idea was, hey, when you get two groups of people together who may have prejudices about one or another, or may not understand each other, or may not trust each other, that contact breeds familiarity. Contact can breed trust. And at a basic level, there is some truth to that. However, subsequent research fleshed out a lot about how to structure intergroup contact so that the outcome is positive, so that it reduces mistrust, reduces stereotyping, and doesn't backfire on you. So this table is from an academic paper. Again, the footnotes here if you want to read more, but it lists a number of conditions that research suggests should be met so that contact between different groups, whether they're divided by politics, race, etc., can be a successful trust-building exercise and not a train wreck. So one, think about status, right? This is a lesson that came out of a lot of labor management disputes and mediation, right? A lot of times when you put labor and management in a room, they're very unequal, right? Management tends to have more money. They tend to be in charge, right? So how do you address that? You know, if you want to structure a deliberate, dialogue process, you want to bring folks who lean left or lean right together, you might consider sort of controlling for other lines of difference, at least to get started, focus on bringing together a group that is relatively ethnically homogeneous, right? Or ensuring that socioeconomically, they're fairly similar, so that you don't have these other lines of difference, unequal socioeconomic status, different racial categories that can exacerbate difference and make you deal with groups that are of unequal status in our society. Cooperation, find ways to set up activities that force your mixed group to cooperate. So maybe in this case, it's students working together on a group project. Maybe it's, getting people together to clean up trash along a section of a highway. Have common goals. Maybe that's, an intramural softball team or a soccer team, right? Where you're all, whatever other differences you may have, you're working together towards some common objective. And then the bottom one, support by social and institutional authorities. This is a big one, right? I used to do a lot of work in Israel and Palestine, and a lot of the intergroup contact work that was done there was not very successful, like getting Israeli and Palestinian kids to play soccer together, because the structural relationship between the two sides is so unequal, right? Most Palestinians aren't citizens. They're under Israeli military rule. They don't have the right to vote. So having kids have happy feelings together on a soccer pitch only gets you so far when you're still dealing with these profound, structural inequities. So these are all things to think about, but these are things that to some extent you can control for and ensure that when you are bringing groups together across the political divide, that you're setting yourself up for success again. Also, think about what I call the indirect approach. So you don't have to, simply get groups together for the lofty goal of, fighting polarization. You can just get groups together to work on a common project, like we talked about a moment ago. There is research that suggests that people who have sort of political differences, who go on walks together, may be more successful at resolving those differences. This, again, is in Peter Coleman's book that I footnoted earlier in the presentation. Something about moving together will naturally push people to sync up to some extent. Have fun. Maybe you're just getting the kids together and having ice cream, right? Like, again, if we're thinking about these engagements as long-term trust-building exercises, as exercises in humanization, it often makes sense to start with the easier stuff. Start with the stuff that's more fun before you get to more challenging issues. Also, look at your community and look at the institutions that are already there that are bringing people together across partisan differences, right? And this is true all over the United States, or I shouldn't say that. In much of the United States, this is still true. You still have local chambers of commerce and Rotary clubs, and to some extent, faith institutions where they bring together people who are politically mixed. Work in those institutions. If you want to engage in some dialogue effort, find a place where people have already come together. They already have some values or interests in common that you can build off of. Similarly, cultivate specific leaders who have credibility with their own tribes, with their own, political fellow travelers, and that may have some credibility on the other side. Find these natural leaders and work with them because they can help you bring others along. Also, especially when thinking about the sort of the intermediate, the group level, the community level, think about norms. Norms, what are norms? And these are the unwritten rules that can make or break our democracy. Be looking for opportunities to set expectations about how we should treat one another. And in particular, what we should expect from our leaders. Look for opportunities to move groups of opinion leaders together. I'm footnoting here a book by an academic at the University of Pennsylvania. It is a very dense read, but she's looking at social norm change. In particular, she looks at the practice of female genital mutilation in certain communities in Africa and examines how did they eradicate it. And what she finds is that if you could convince all of the men of village X, all the elders at once, to come out as a block and say, hey, this thing we've been doing to girls in our community is bad and we should stop doing it, you're much more likely to change that norm, in this case, to stop FGM. So keep this in mind. There's value in working behind the scenes to sort of knit together coalitions so that the people you want to move in turn see that they have strength in numbers and that they could come out, in a way that might be politically sensitive for them if they have some cover. Another example of this norm strengthening work, these are the Carter Center and the Ford Center, the Gerald R. Ford Center's candidate principles for trusted elections. This is something that we were promoting in the run-up to last year's midterm elections and that we will continue to promote through the 2024 election cycle. These are 5 simple principles that we think all candidates for office in the US ought to be able to sign up to. You can click on the hyperlink. Of course, we'll send these slides around. You can go onto this site and sign yourself up. We'd love it if you would do that. We have some major candidates for office from both parties that signed on to these principles back in the fall. We have our fellow Americans from all 50 states that have signed on. But why did we do this? For the Carter Center, this is an exercise in norm strengthening. This is an example of articulating positive values that we would like to think most folks can sign on to, and hopefully creating a virtuous cycle whereby everybody sees, yes, we're playing by these rules, the community values it, and so candidate X, I'm going to sign on as well. Last but not least, on the community side, look for opportunities, especially in crisis. This is sad to say, but true. This is something else referenced in Peter Coleman's book. Violent crises in particular can be a wake-up call and an opportunity to reset to some extent. I think in our history, the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people, including 19 children, was one such opportunity. And in the aftermath of that attack, we did see the sort of far-right anti-government militia movement take a step back, disavow violence. We saw, of course, much greater law enforcement scrutiny of these groups, and the ability to have a national conversation about this. I can see how in our rather gridlocked national environment, this can seem pretty depressing, right? You can see almost every day in the headlines, things that ought to be a national crisis, that ought to be a moment for this national reset that we're not able to capitalize on. But look locally, right? What if the Proud Boys start showing up at school board meetings in communities in Wisconsin. This is, of course, a right-wing extremist group, members of which are currently on trial for seditious conspiracy for their role in January 6th. That might be the kind of thing around which you can rally a broad spectrum of people in your community. Say, hey, whatever else we agree or disagree on, we don't want guys like this, harassing people at school board meetings. So look for these opportunities locally. Okay, last but not least, I want to say a little bit about the 10,000 foot level, about our country. You will recall that in the presentation from last week, where I talked about these structural drivers of polarization, I referred to what I called quirks in our democracy. We talked about how the US system of government, the Electoral College, our majoritarian electoral system, single member districts, all these things are somewhat unusual facets of American democracy that can exacerbate polarization and are even correlated to instability and political violence. So what do we do about that? Well, then you got to talk about reforming the system. And there are lots of ways to plug into that work. Here in Wisconsin, there are, of course, lots of orgs working on redistricting. Again, these are all hyperlinks. You can click on these and go to websites for all these organizations. I've just listed here the different issues that these different orgs work on. Ranked choice voting. I mean, that may be one anecdote to the sort of the bipolar nature of our electoral contests, right? Unite America is working on nonpartisan primaries. I think we talked a little bit last week about how the primary process also tends to pull us toward extremes. There's a bunch of general resources at the Campaign Legal Center, an organization that was founded by a Republican. Keep in mind, we have a history in this country of changing the Constitution, even the Constitution, to make the system more accountable to the public. In 1912, we passed the 17th Amendment as an example, allowing for the direct election of senators. Okay, so here are some resources that you can plug into to think about and work on these big national level questions of reform. But we also have to talk about race and racial equity. You will recall last week that when I listed these structural drivers of polarization, we talked about the rise in the foreign-born population of the United States. This chart plots polarization in the House of Representatives over time against the foreign-born population, denoted by those red dots. It only runs through 1999, but you get the gist. To put kind of an international lens on this for a minute, in our country, of course, we fought a civil war, the Union won, but in the aftermath of that conflict, we never really engaged in what would be called a truth and reconciliation or transitional justice process. We never had a national process through which we could air what happened, foremost to enslaved people, give them an opportunity to share their grievances and the horrors that they endured, and then hopefully come to some national consensus that, boy, that was really bad, and then figure out what to do about it in a material and a moral sense. We never really did that as a country. And I would argue our failure to reckon with that going back to the 1860s is a lot of why there are so many unresolved questions of racial equity in our country. There's, of course, tons of data on this, right? Differing levels of household wealth for white and non-white Americans, differing outcomes with the criminal justice system, with police encounters, you name it, right? There are some deep structural features of our racialized political system that have never been addressed. And so it is therefore not surprising that when our country becomes, as it has over the last 20 or so years, more racially and ethnically diverse, that is somewhat destabilizing to the political system because we have all these unresolved long-term issues. So what do we do about that? I know this is hard. None of us are going to wave a wand and fix it, but it is worth noting, first of all, that this very year, there are parallel bills in the House and the Senate. Senate bill introduced by Cory Booker of New Jersey to at least study, at least think about how one would do reparations in this country. But beyond that, even if you accept that, a national truth and reconciliation process is not going to happen soon, there are ways to do this locally. Again, these are all hyperlinks. Click on this link for this Kellogg Foundation initiative. They have a toolkit that you can download to run a kind of local truth-telling process about racial justice in your community. The Equal Justice Initiative, those are the folks who developed the lynching memorial and the big museum down in Alabama. They also have a kind of local toolkit for examining in a given county the history of any lynchings that may have occurred. And if you go through this process of uncovering this history and talking about it, you can also get a marker, a historical marker to know what happened. I mean, this stuff is all really, really big. It's hard, but there are things I think we can do. So last but not least, I want to just say a few words about how to deal with the many, many challenges that you will encounter as you embark on this journey, because this is really hard. This is really hard stuff. You're going to go into some of these hard conversations and people are going to say things to you that make you angry. You're going to want to react strongly. And I just want to share a few suggestions for how to deal with some of that. So the first two are really things for you to think about and have in your mind before you start some of these hard engagements. Pause and reflect, right? Be prepared to take a deep breath when someone says something to you that makes you angry and makes you want to jump down their throat. You may have to think about that in advance. And when you're taking that deep breath, do number two, return to the big picture. Remind yourself, why are you having this conversation with your cousin Bob who annoys you, right? You're trying to build understanding because it matters, right? Because he's your family or he's your friend or whatever. Use that to reset and give yourself the space and the grace to try to move on constructively. Another technique that comes from the sort of the international conflict world. Write the other person's story. I talked about the importance of sharing your origin stories. Why do you hold the views you do? What in your personal experience brought you to this? Maybe not in the first meeting, but if you're committing to multiple engagements with someone with whom you're different, a few meetings in, you should be able to do that. Your cousin Bob who annoys you at Thanksgiving dinner, if you commit to those engagements with Bob, you should be able, literally or figuratively, to write down as though you were in his shoes, from his perspective, why does he feel the way he does? And if you can do that, it will be very helpful, again, in understanding where the other person is coming from, but also giving you kind of a shared foundation to build from. Number four, this is a classic in the field, especially of international conflict resolution. I footnoted here Roger Fisher and Bill Urey's classic book. It's now like in its 5th edition or something. Separate the interest from the positions. If you haven't heard this one before, the idea here is that when you are in conflict with someone or even attempting dialogue, what that person says may be different from what they need. Not necessarily because they're lying to you or being disingenuous, just because we ourselves may not understand at a deeper level what it is we need. We're just locked into what we think we want or a certain way of articulating a given need. If you can figure that out, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, getting to that underlying need may be a way to find and build on common ground. Similarly, this is one I learned from an Israeli years ago. Again, if you're further along in a process of dialogue, can you get to a point where you and the other party can write each other's victory speech? What do I mean by that? Well, if you've reached some agreement, right? You've come to some common ground or common understanding on issue X. Presumably, you have both compromised to some extent, but you've compromised in a way that you can still sell to whoever your tribe is, whoever your constituents are. So writing the other person's victory speech is a way for you to practice how they would have to articulate the compromise they're making to you, to your side, but also the way in which it is still some kind of face-saving victory to their side. This, again, is a good exercise in just getting yourself in the shoes of the other person and then taking from there to moving into creative problem solving. Last but not least, the last thing I want to say today, the thing I started out with last week, have grace for all of our fellow Americans who are locked in this complex system that is much bigger than any of us. Getting out of this is going to be hard, but understanding how big this is should in turn make us more understanding of our fellow Americans, despite sometimes profound disagreements. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to discuss.
Nathan, thank you so much for your thoughts here. Lots of good things to muse on. It looks like we have a hand raised already. So Nathaniel would like to be part of the party. So hang on a second, Nathaniel. Okay, Nathaniel, you should be live here. Okay.
May I go ahead?
Go for it.
Thank you. This speaks more to what you were commenting on last week. I'm curious, what do you see as the historical antecedents of polarization? Do you trace it all the way back to the 1960s with the turmoil of the Vietnam War, a backlash to the civil rights movement in general? I noticed you showed two charts, one on polarization in Congress, one with a correlation between polarization and foreign-born people. And there's a real change in the 1960s. And I'm just kind of curious if you could comment on kind of what you see as the historical origins of this deep polarization in the society, more broadly speaking. Thank you. Back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Nathaniel. Carrie, do you want me to answer questions one at a time or take a few and then I'll answer? Or...
Go for it. You can take that one. I'm not seeing anything else that's a direct relation to that.
Okay. So as I alluded to at the end there, I think the roots of this go very deep. I think given the way in which race and politics are closely aligned in the US today, and really have been since the Civil War, you can't separate the two. I think the unresolved aspects of the legacy of slavery are a big part of this. And that gets to fundamental questions of who counts as an American. Can everybody count as an American regardless of the color of one's skin or one's creed? I don't think we've resolved all that. And I don't think we had resolved it, even in these periods of lower polarization, say back in the early 20th century. I think part of why you begin to see the division ticking up starting in the 60s and 70s, and this isn't necessarily my analysis, but I recommend this book, American Poison by Eduardo Porter. He looks at the relationship between race and the social welfare state, and argues that after the reforms of the Johnson administration and the Great Society program, when we really tried to expand the social safety net to all Americans, regardless of race, right? That's when many white Americans began to not support social welfare spending. And, of course, former President Nixon capitalized on that very adroitly. So I think the 60s conflicts are a part of this, but I would argue it's even deeper than that. It goes to some of these fundamental questions of who's an American. Yes, also the sum of us.
Nathan, I've received a question. Sorry, Nathaniel, did you have any follow-ups on that, or are you?
No, I just said thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have another raised hand here. Oh, no, it has gone away. I'm going to go. Oh, here we are. We are back. Technology is grand. Here we go. Matthew, I'm going to get you on screen here. You should be able to unmute yourself. Matthew, you should be on.
All right. My question has to do with the increasing propensity of Americans to sort themselves geographically by ideology, and how that is likely to play out. people moving to red states or blue states be away from people who aren't like them. And it would seem to be a huge impediment to having those discussions if all of your neighbors are in lockstep.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, Matthew. And we talked about this some last week. I shared, Bill Bishop's data that went through 2004 and charts that very process. And there's many reasons to think it's only gotten worse since 2004. I was on a call with a colleague in Florida last week who commented on the number of right-leaning folks that she's encountered in Florida who say they've moved there to leave more left-leaning states and to come to a state that has a particularly conservative governor. So this is certainly something that's continuing, and it makes it harder. It makes it harder to find people with whom you may disagree. Unfortunately, the only answer to that is I think you kind of have to go out of your way to find them. You may want to consider, joining clubs or associations, finding social networks that you can plug into where you are more likely to encounter an ideologically heterogeneous group of people. But you may have to work at it, because you're right, we have sorted in a lot of ways, including in my experience in houses of worship.
Yeah, in my experience, of course, I live in a small town. It tends very conservative. Along the way, I've served in municipal government. I've served as village president. And over the past 4 or 5 years, in step with the national trends, I've really seen a trend toward less accommodation, less dialogue, less ability to reach across those lines. And even with that, then I find myself pulling back too, because it becomes hard to maintain.
Yeah, I hear you. I wish I had an easier answer.
Thank you.
This overlaps with several questions that showed up in the chat. I mean, there are requests to say, are there additional things we can do to keep ourselves or our in-groups from giving in to the drivers of polarization? What do we do when we approach a conversation with a genuine interest of coming together, but the other party doesn't want to engage on that level? So, I think this is really percolating among us. And folks are here because there's this longing to overcome this pervasive issue of which this sorting is really just one symptom.
Sure. Well, I think there's 2 ways you could approach those hard cases, for lack of a better term. On the one hand, I would double down on what I said a moment ago, which is commit to multiple engagements, and you don't have to start with the hard stuff, right? So if you've got people in your life who you want to share with, but they don't want to share with you in that way, or they don't want to have these more sensitive conversations, okay, talk about your kids and your pets and the Packers, right? But stay in it, stay in it for the long haul, so that you've got some other foundation of trust and understanding and humanization, even if you disagree on a whole range of issues. There's so much value in that process of humanization, because that is what keeps us from viewing our fellow Americans as enemies. That is what keeps our disputes in the realm of political disputes and policy disagreements, as opposed to feelings of outright enmity, right? Because the other person's a human being like you. You both love the Packers. You both love golden retrievers, right? That's not nothing. It's really not. Having said that, and I suspect this is an experience that many have had, you're going to find some folks who just don't want to engage at all, right? And there's nothing you can do. You can't move them. You're not going to reach everyone. So I do also want to set that expectation. There are some cases in which the gap is going to just be too big, but I don't think that means as a country or as a society we're somehow doomed. The key is to do what you can where you can, and bring those together who you can, and that counts for a lot, even if you're not going to move everyone.
It seems to me that this humanizing process that you've talked about is also an important first step if we're talking about micro level truth and reconciliation processes, because you're asking a lot of vulnerability of people who have been victimized in present and in history to be willing to recount what has happened. And if you're going to do that, you need a basis of trust that someone is going to receive your stories with respect.
Yeah. And there are ways, as I hope I've illustrated, to communicate that. I mean, to at least in yourself, to show I'm listening, I'm ready for whatever you throw at me, even if I don't agree with it. I'm a safe space for you to express your views, right? I mean, there's also survey data that suggests that Americans just tend to be uncomfortable having political conversations. In fact, there's data that suggests that Americans, compared to people in other democracies today, are less likely to have these conversations at all across lines of difference than, say, Italians or French or Brits, because we're fearful of just not being understood or getting into an argument or whatever. But again, there are ways that you can show that you're open and you're kind of a safe space for hard conversations.
There's a question that's come up in the chat of how we might respond when people want to skip over any whiff of conflict by saying, oh, we'll just agree to disagree.
I think you need a balance there. I mean, I think, sometimes that may be the correct approach for a time. But if your goal, if your interest is getting beyond that, getting beyond agree to disagree and finding some common ground, my recommendation is, okay, make a mental note, maybe in the short term. All right, we agree to disagree, do other things, walk your dogs together, talk about Star Wars, but lay foundation and build trust so that you can find an opportune moment to come back to the underlying issues that you do disagree on, even if it takes a little time. I don't think you have to be immediately put off by that.
There was just one technical question in the chat. I just wanted to make sure we addressed for someone. She wanted clarification on foreign born. That was first generation, not multiple generations in, correct?
Right. That is born not in the US. That does not account for the children of folks born outside the US.
Excellent. I am not seeing any other hands raised or questions coming in, and I know we're coming to the end of the hour. Nathan, are there things you wanted to say as we wrap up, or things you wanted to say about where the Carter Center is going next in this work?
Sure. Well, I want to emphasize that as big and scary and frustrating as all of these challenges are for our country, for our communities, there are things we can do. Again, Reverend Parker, if one of you would share the slides with everybody, like click on the links, read the books, there are things that you can do constructively at different levels and at different levels of effort, right? Some of us have more free time than others, that can constructively push back on some of this. So I don't want folks to feel discouraged. We can make change. We created these systems, we can uncreate them. We really can. That's the big positive note. Second, the Carter Center is going to be expanding the cross-partisan violence resilience work that we are currently doing in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina into Wisconsin. Wisconsin is the next state on our list. Among other things, we will be hiring. I will send a scope of work around. Reverend Parker, I'll send it back to you, and if you could forward it to your network. It's not ready yet, but we will be recruiting for a couple of part-time people, and they need to be pretty partisan. We need one person with a Democratic Rolodex and profile and one with a Republican profile, who can help us recruit fellow partisans across the political spectrum into this sort of pro-civic, pro-democracy anti-violence network that we will be building. So I will be in touch on that. As that network comes together, and we'll want to get these people in position first, but as it comes together, I hope I'll have an opportunity to share back with you what we're doing and invite all of you to join, right? This is another way for us of trying to create institutions that any American can plug into to contribute to addressing these big national challenges. So you will hear more from me, whether you like it or not.
I suspect we'll appreciate it very much indeed. So thank you, Nathan. Thank you to your colleagues at the Carter Center for the important work that you do, not just here in the US, but all over the globe. And thank you to all of you for committing time today to this work and for your ministries, wherever in the state or the country you may be. You have our blessings, you have community. Go forth and get into good trouble. Take care, people.
Thanks.